for joining us today here at Cornerstone Church. We are a church that loves God and loves others. If you have any questions or would like to find out more, check us out online at bethaltochurch.com. We'd also love to connect with you in person. Cornerstone Church meets every Sunday morning at 10:10 in Bethalto, Illinois. We look forward to seeing you. And now, onto the message.
I recently saw someone reading a book. Now, that may not seem like that's that much of an amazing act, although in today's culture with digital devices and all of that, it's kind of rare to see people reading. It wasn't so much that this guy was reading, it was where I saw him reading and how I saw him reading. I saw him reading while I was driving down the highway, and he was in the car next to me. And he had his book on, not the dashboard, on the steering wheel. And he was kind of doing one of these, as he was reading, as he was driving down the road. Now, I want to applaud the fact that this man is actually reading. We want to be readers, we want to be alert. Yeah, we can applaud, but not while you're driving. That is not a good idea. And it was in plain sight, too. It wasn't like he was even trying to hide it. We have all these different laws today about texting and driving, and you would think that people would understand the dangers of distracted driving. I don't know how well you follow those laws with your cell phone, but nonetheless, I think they're appropriate and they're good for us. They help us not to be distracted while we're driving. But there are a variety of different things that people do when they're driving that just kind of causes me to scratch my head. One of the things I don't think I'll ever understand is women putting on makeup while they drive. Okay. You have a pointy thing by your eye, okay? Even if you're stopped at a stoplight, it's a pointy thing by your eye, and if somebody rear ends you or something happens, that's not good for your eyeball, okay? My wife said the other day she saw a man shaving. Okay, now I've seen the electric razors, but if you are using a straight razor while you're driving, again, pointy thing in the vicinity of your face, it's not healthy for you in the long run, okay? Eating, this fast food restaurants, they encourage eating while you drive. I'm generally okay with this. I do this, a burger or a sandwich and fries. But I think we all need to agree here that anything that you're eating that requires a utensil is off limits, right? Like, you don't take your Chinese takeout and start using, the chopsticks and eating, again, pointy things by your face. Not a good idea, not healthy when we're driving. Somebody mentioned Taco Bell. I like Taco Bell. I love Taco Bell. But don't eat tacos when you're driving. Unless you're a barbarian, right, and you turn the taco sideways to eat, you've got to turn your head to eat a taco, and that's not healthy for you when you're driving. And if it cracks, then there's again what? Pointy things by your face. Okay, there's a theme here. I'm going to get off theme for just a minute. I've mentioned this before. I don't want to offend anybody. I'm just telling you I don't understand it. The other distraction is dogs on people's laps. Now, I've mentioned this before, and I was inundated on my Facebook page with all of you and your pets in your cars. It was amazing. But I don't understand, you will strap your children in and yourself in. But Fifi, we're just going to leave Fifi on our seat. No, if you love your dog, I would think you would want to strap the dog in as well. Okay, if you haven't figured it out, today we are talking about distractions. Distractions. There's all sorts of distractions when we're driving. We're in a series of messages looking at the New Testament book of Colossians. Last week we looked at Colossians verses 1 through 4 of chapter 3. And in those 4 verses, the Apostle Paul encourages us to set our minds and our hearts on things above. He says, look, don't focus on the things of this earth, but set your mind on Jesus. And really throughout this letter, Paul has been reminding us that Christ is supreme. He's the one that we are to focus on. So instead of focusing on temporary things of this earth, he encourages us to look to him. So we had this principle that we looked at last week. It's a very simple idea. You steer where you stare. You steer where you stare. So where you're looking at, that's where you're going to end up being. And that's the encouragement Paul says. Paul says, stare at Jesus and steer your life to him. Now, just like there are a variety of ways that you can be distracted in a car when you're driving, there are a variety of ways that we can be distracted from our faith in Jesus. We can be distracted from staring at him and steering our lives to him. And just like distractions when you're driving can be deadly, distractions to our faith can destroy our spiritual lives as well. That's because distractions deter us from right action. Distractions cause us to stare at the wrong things, to steer off into the wrong direction. And so, just because I want to make sure we're on the same page here, what the Apostle Paul is going to do in the upcoming verses is he's going to list out sins. I'm kind of using the language of distractions, but I don't want to minimize what Paul is talking about here at all. The Apostle Paul is calling out sin for what it is, and he's calling believers to remove it and to eradicate sin from their lives. He frames it in a very serious manner. Look at what he says here at the beginning of verse 5. He says, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature." Now, my wife is a kind-hearted, loving woman. But if you are a bug or an insect in our house, may God have mercy on your soul. That is if bugs even have souls, which I'm sure my wife would argue they don't, okay? I have seen my wife find an ant in our house and get the ant spray out and just unload half a bottle of ant spray on one single ant. I mean, do not mess with my wife if you are a bug in our house. Before we moved here, probably 10 or 12 years ago, when we were up in the Chicagoland area, south suburbs, we had these little bugs called springtails that were in our house. And when I say they were in our house, I think we saw maybe a dozen of them. They're like microscopic little knit type things. And my wife, she went online, she made these traps for them, and they were attracted by lights. So at night she would turn a light on and keep a light on it, and then she would go out and investigate. Her sole function was to eradicate every single insect that could possibly enter or had entered into our home. Now, Paul is using that same kind of mindset or language here in the verse. This is strong language. I mean, it's violent language. Put it to death. Kill it. Get rid of it. Put it down. Last week, the command that we had was to set our minds on things above. It's an ongoing command. The Greek is in the original Greek, it's an ongoing. Keep setting your mind on things above. And it's the same way with this commandment here. Keep putting these earthly things to death in your life. And the reason for this strong language is that if these sins or these distractions are not killed, if they're not put away with, then they will kill you. That's the harshness of what we're talking about. These things are so serious that if we don't deal with them, they will kill us. They will destroy our spiritual lives. Now, the Apostle Paul gives us two kind of main areas. He gives us two different lists of vices or of sins. And they are not meant to be exhaustive, and cover every single sin that's possible. We're not even really sure. We think maybe these things were probably present in the church in Colossae, and so Paul is maybe writing because it deals with them specifically. But the reality is these are things that are true for us today in our church and in our culture and our world today. So he gives us two lists, and the first list, he says this. He says, don't be distracted by vices of sex. Verse 5. He says, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature. And then he gives us 5 ways, 5 things that are part of our earthly nature. Sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry, he says. So, gives us these 5 different vices that we need to remove from our life. And the list here, it moves from specific to general. So some of you, you're looking at this list and you're thinking greed doesn't maybe seem to line up with the other sexual sins that are listed here. And the reason for that is because Paul is moving from specific to general, and we'll explain that kind of as we go. So he starts specifically with sexual immorality. Now, sexual immorality is all kinds of sexual sins that violate the marriage bond and God's design for sexuality between a husband and wife. This is really kind of focused on the act of sex itself. It's very likely that Paul has the Old Testament in mind, in Leviticus, where there are very clear instructions and guidelines that God is giving. And so really, in some ways, this is kind of the culmination of all of the other sins that are listed here in this list, that it all kind of points and leads to this. So some of you in the room here today, you may not be tempted right now to go commit adultery or to have an affair or to sleep with someone, have a sexual relationship with someone outside of marriage. And that might be the case for you. But the others on the list could very well apply to you. So this is kind of like the culmination of the others that are here. So the next one that he lists is impurity. And this is more broad than sexual immorality, and it refers to other sexual sins. So for instance, pornography would be found here. Now, pornography isn't sex itself, but it's a sexual interaction outside of God's design. And I spent some time this week researching some statistics on porn use, and there's too many statistics to even begin to recite here. But generally speaking, I looked at a particular set of research by Gallup this week, and generally speaking, about 50% of men, all men in the U.S., Christian and non-Christian, 50% of men admit to seeking out porn on a weekly basis, okay? 50%. Every other guy is seeking out porn on a weekly basis. For women, it's about 25% of women seek it out weekly. And not only that, but the world's view, our culture's view on pornography is shifting. One of the staggering findings of a Gallup poll several years ago was that young people view not recycling as more morally wrong than viewing pornography, okay? So not recycling is viewed by many young people as more morally wrong than looking at pornography, okay? And then just a report that came out just a few days ago from Gallup said that the acceptance of pornography is quickly on the rise. Last year, 36% of Americans said that pornography was acceptable, and it's okay. 36% last year. 41% this year say that it is acceptable. The point that I'm making is this. It is highly likely that many people, several people in the room here today, are struggling with an addiction to pornography. And you need to talk to somebody about this. You need to bring it into the light. You need to make yourself accountable with someone else. This is a serious thing, and you need, as Paul says, you need to put it to death. You cannot allow it to linger, otherwise it will put you to death spiritually. So Paul starts with this list, very specific, sexual immorality, speaking about adultery outside of the marriage relationship, and then he broadens it a little bit, and he talks about impurity, and then he moves next to lust. Lust is uncontrolled sexual urges. It's our sexual desires gone awry. It's allowing our mind to linger on a thought. You know, thoughts come into our minds. The thought isn't bad, but what we do with it can be the problem. And lust is when we linger on those thoughts and let them fester. And you can see how lust can lead you to impurity, which can then lead you to sexual immorality. Next on the list is evil desires. Evil desires, that phrase or that word is not always used in a sexual context. It is here because that's what Paul's talking about. But again, you can see there's evil desires that start to rise up, and then they take focus in lust, and they move on down the line. The last one that he mentions is greed, which is, he says, idolatry. Now, this is very general, and greed might seem out of place because greed obviously refers to more than just things that are sexual in nature. Greed is unchecked hunger for physical pleasure. It's the breeding ground for more specific kinds of desires. And so Paul is telling us that at the source of many issues with sex is greed. And he clarifies that this is idolatry. Idolatry is removing God from the center of your attention and placing something else in his place. And in this case, he's saying if you put sex at the center of your life, that will lead you down this path towards more dangerous and more defiling actions and sin. The point of mentioning greed is that sexual sins arise because people have uncontrolled desires for more and more. It's a form of idolatry. It's worshiping the creation instead of the creator. So what do we do with this? Church, to put something to death, you have to cut off the supply lines. Like, nobody wakes up and says, I'm going to go commit adultery today. I'm going to have sex outside of marriage if they haven't already engaged in the other items in the list that lead up to it. Nobody just wakes up and decides that they're going to do that. If you are in an adulterous relationship right now, or if you're struggling with pornography, don't complain about your inability to resist it if you've ignored the earlier stages, or worse, if you've welcomed the earlier stages. You've got to cut it off at the root. You have to attack it from its source. It's a process. Sin is always a development into something greater and greater. Church, our job as believers is to investigate the supply lines of our lives and investigate the supply lines of whatever our sins are that we're facing. We need to cut them off without pity, destroy them before they destroy us, and destroy us, they will. It says this in the next verse. Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived. Look, church, we don't like to talk about God's wrath, but God's wrath is real. It's not malicious or vengeful or spiteful, but God's wrath is the active reaction against all that is contrary to his nature. It's like a recoiling of God's entire being. And as we engage in these practices, we begin to lose our humanity. God designed us in a particular way to experience these things in a particular manner. And when we violate that and when we walk in contrast to that, we begin to lose our humanity. We ultimately separate ourselves from God because we move farther and farther away from him and his design. God didn't just arbitrarily sit up in heaven one day and say, I'm going to make sex out of marriage. I'm going to make that a sin because that's just too much fun. He didn't. No, that's not how it works. There's an analogy that you've probably heard. I've heard it many times. An analogy about fire. You know, fire in a fireplace is a great thing. It brings warmth and light. It can be fascinating to look at, and it can create kind of an atmosphere in the room. And it's wonderful. It's great there. But if you take that fire and you knock some of those logs out of the fire into the middle of your living room, your house is going to go up in flames. And in the same way, God designed sex to be experienced in a particular way, in a particular relationship between husband and wife. And if you try to knock things out of that and experience it outside of that context, it's going to set your spirit in flames. Certainly, when we talk about hell, for eternity potentially, because we are allowing ourselves to experience destructive behaviors that God never intended for our lives. God says that sex is good. It should be experienced between a husband and wife in marriage. But when you take it out and experience it outside of its context, it's destructive to your soul. Paul says, don't think the way the world does. Think differently. Live according to this new nature. This is what Paul means when he says, you used to walk in these ways. It used to be acceptable. Our world can have all the different mentality and mindset and viewpoint on sex that they want, but if you call yourself a Christian, your mindset should be different. I'm going to go off my script here a minute because I just remembered an article I read this week that came across on my notifications on my phone. It said it said stop going to church or something, and it was an article that this pastor wrote, and he was basically saying there's a lot of people that come to church, but they don't really believe the Bible. It's like, and if that's you, then just stop coming. You're not helping us. And I would just encourage you today, like, you can disagree with me and that's fine, but if you disagree with me, you're going to have to take that up with the Apostle Paul and what he says, because if you are a believer, you are supposed to be living differently than the way the world accepts. And I'm sorry if that offends you, but that's what the Word of God is telling us. We are to be different. You used to walk in those ways. Throughout this letter, I've said it over and over again, the Apostle Paul says that we have died with Jesus. We're no longer in the dominion of darkness, but we're now in the kingdom of the Son. So why does Paul tell us to put this to death? Isn't the sinful nature already dead? And the answer is yes, it is. In our participation with Christ or our union with Him, the old nature has died. But in these verses, Paul is simply acknowledging that nevertheless, we are doing life in this world. We're actually straddled between the two, between the old and the new. And we've put to death the old, but we live here in the new, and there's a tension that will constantly exist as long as we're here on this earth. And we have to make a choice to constantly to live in accordance with the spiritual experience that we proclaim. The spiritual experience that says, I am identifying with Christ. I'm dead to this world, and I'm alive to Him. In other words, be, Christian, be who you are. If you are a believer, if you're a follower of Jesus, be who you are. You are a child of God. You used to walk in those ways. You used to live in that life. Now be different. The old has died. The new has come. So leave behind what you are no longer. Put to death what belongs to your worldly nature. Don't allow it one more moment in your life. The Apostle Paul continues. He moves on from vices of sex and he moves to vices of speech. Verses 8 and 9. But now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other. Now, Paul lists out these other verses, or these other items on this list, but he kind of does the opposite in this list that he did in the other list. In the other list, he went from specific to general, and here he's going from general to specific. And the first three are very general because they're attitudes. And he's saying that improper attitudes lead to improper speech. It starts with anger. Anger is continual. It's seething. It's smoldering under the surface. Rage is next. Rage and anger are very similar, but rage is expressed more in outbursts from time to time. Next is malice. So you start with this underlying anger that's kind of there, and then rage causes it to have outbursts. But then malice is more focused. It is eagerness to harm someone else. That outburst becomes intentional towards someone. And then that malice then turns to slander. This is speech that puts malice into action. It's abusive speech, tearing someone down or destroying them. That moves to filthy language, which are words that are abusive with intent, speaking inappropriate or foul words, cursing, and those kinds of things. Last is lying. And lying, of course, is deception. Now, truth can be inconvenient. It can make us uncomfortable. And sometimes we're tempted to twist the truth in order to make it a little bit less awkward for ourselves. It can be embarrassing to face the truth. But church, the Christian community is to be characterized by truth and truthfulness. The reality is with these two different lists, the lists of sexual vices and the list of vices of speech, too often in the church we've given so much attention to the former and we give little attention to the latter, which is why gossip can be so prevalent in a church, which is why we can talk about somebody and we can slander them and no one will call us out for it. Church, these aren't, it isn't about one being worse than the other. We have to address all of these issues in our lives. We have to rid ourselves of these attitudes and actions. We're not going to prevent a lustful thought or a hateful thought from maybe coming into our mind, but we need to deal with it right then and there before they turn into actions, or in this case, words. We need to rid ourselves of these kinds of sinful speech by getting to the root of the problem. And now notice that as this list narrows here, it focuses more and more on our interactions with other people. Anger, left unchecked, will inevitably be expressed negatively towards someone else. And Paul's ultimate concern here is the community. Not necessarily the outside community, those who are not believers, but his concern is the Christian community. Paul's writing this letter to believers, not to unbelievers. And he concludes by telling us why this is necessary. First, he says it's necessary because we have a new self. Verses 9 and 10. Since you have taken off your old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Paul's using a metaphor of changing clothes. He says you're taking off one thing and you're putting on something else. And the metaphor isn't about making promises. God, I promise to try to stop lusting. God, I promise to try to stop lying. Paul is talking about action in response to God's grace. Do you believe the grace and the forgiveness and the love that you've experienced? It's leaving one family, one household for another, and changing from the dominion of darkness into the kingdom of the Son. It's submitting to a new set of rules and a new way of living. It's being who we are as Christians, no longer slaves to sin. We've been set free to be members of God's family. Now, in the ancient world, clothing could be very symbolic. Religious leaders often they would wear robes and they were identified by that. You have politicians and they were identified, and authorities and emperors, they were identified with what they wore. Roman soldiers were identified by the things that they wore. And so what Paul is saying is he's saying, look, you were identified by the way that you used to live, but now you've put on something else, so identify yourself in that way. You have a new humanity, or a new self. And then secondly, he says, there's a new humanity. I love this last verse here that we're looking at today in verse 11. It says this, here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Paul has another list for us. He got really happy with the lists in this part of his letter, okay? And he has another list for us, and he says, look, he talks about race, Gentile or Jew. He talks about religion, circumcised or uncircumcised, culture, barbarian or Scythian, social status, slave or free. Paul declares that Jesus breaks down all of these barriers that our world sets up. When we commit our lives to Jesus, we commit ourselves to a new humanity. It's not just an individual new self, our personal relationship with God, but when we enter into faith, we commit ourselves to a new humanity that happens, a new grouping of people, God's family, we are together. The church is the visible expression of this new humanity on earth, and this is why Paul is so concerned about the Christian community. Sexual misbehavior can tear a community apart. People will often say, well, what I do with my sex life is just a private matter. But it seldom is, because it'll destroy interpersonal relationships, and especially for believers, it destroys the church's testimony for those people who call themselves believers and engage in that activity. But malicious and abusive speaking also destroys the Christian community as well. Church, our job as Christians is to erase the lines that divide us. I mean, look at how fragmented our country is today. You're on the right, you're on the left, you're in this category, you're in that category, you're in and you're out, you have a social status, you don't have social status, you're rich, you're poor, you're this color you're skinned, you're that color skinned. Our whole world is doing all of this, but church, we are to be different. We are to set ourselves apart by avoiding the distractions of the vices that Paul has mentioned. We're not creating some mushy, kumbaya, lovey-dovey club where we all get along, but we aim to transform our fractured world that we live in by the love of Jesus in us and through us, where we welcome others in, we seek forgiveness, we find wholeness in Christ. So church, our response today is very, very simple. Put to death the sins that distract you from Jesus. Put to death anything that distracts you from Jesus. If you're not a believer in the room today, if you're far from Him, I want to encourage you to make the confession that Jesus is Lord. Make Jesus your Lord. Confess that today. Make that statement. And when you do, you will be made new. God will transform you. You can enter into this new self that Paul talks about. You can be made new. You can set aside that old way of living and enter into the new life. And if you're a believer in the room, can I encourage you today to put to death the sins that distract you from Jesus? Be who you are. Be a child of God. Be a child of God. Live free from sin. Fight it. Talk about it. One of the best ways that we can deal with these vices in our lives is by bringing it to the light and having a discussion with somebody about it. We don't want to do it because it's embarrassing and because we don't want to admit it. And that is exactly the way that the enemy wants it in our lives, because it will continue to fester, it will continue to grow, and it will continue to pull us and our attention away from him. It'll steer us away from Christ. It'll distract us from him and will lead us to destruction. So church, today, let's put to death the sins that distract us from our Savior Jesus. Let's pray.
It was our honor to play a small role in what God is doing in and through your life, and we would love to continue that journey with you. To find out what your next steps could be in your relationship with Christ, check out bethaltochurch.com/next. Thanks for joining us again, and we'll see you next time.